Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to Books Noted Live, a new series presented by the Academy of American Poets, which features two poets with new or forthcoming books. This virtual event is made possible in part by the New York State Council for the Arts and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. Our virtual events this fall-winter season are kept free thanks to generous contributions by you, our audience members. If you're able to make a contribution, please click the button below and visit Poets.org to learn more about becoming a member. My name is Tara Jayakar, and my pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Associate Content Editor and Producer at the Academy of American Poets. For those of you who don't know who we are the nation's leading champion of poets, poetry, and poetry organizations. We also produce Poets.org, originated National Poetry Month, which is celebrated every April, and publish the popular Poem a Day series, among many other free programs and online resources. Before I introduce our amazing two poets and our ASL interpreters, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining this virtual reading and conversation from Brooklyn, New York, which is the traditional lands of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie people, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I would also like to provide a description of my video feed. I am a brown woman of South Indian descent in her early 30s, wearing a checkered jacket, and behind me are two prints, one of Prince and one that says, "Let's eat ice cream and dismantle white supremacy." My back here is pulled into a bun, and I have gold wire frame glasses. Finally, I would like to remind everyone to be respectful of your fellow audience members and of our poets in the chat. Thank you so much for your cooperation. Tonight, I am absolutely thrilled and honored to introduce the poets Joshua Bennett and Kazim Ali. We are also joined by ASL interpreters Ashley West and Derek Gonzalez. Joshua Bennett holds a PhD from Princeton University. He is the author of 3 books of poetry and criticism, The Sobbing School, winner of the National Poetry Series, and a finalist for an NAACP Image Award, Being Property Once Myself, Blackness and the End of Man, and Ode, out now from Penguin Poets. His first work of narrative nonfiction, Spoken Word, A Cultural History, is forthcoming from Knopf in 2021. Dr. Bennett has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ford Foundation, MIT, and the Society of Fellows at Harvard University. He is the Mellon Assistant Professor of English and Creative Writing at Dartmouth. Our second guest poet, Kazim Ali, was born in the United Kingdom and has lived transnationally in the United States, Canada, India, France, and the Middle East. A poet, novelist, translator, and essayist, his newest book is a volume of 3 long poems entitled The Voice of Sheila Chandra, out now from Alice James. After a career in public policy and organizing, Ali taught at various colleges and universities, including Oberlin, Davidson, St. Mary's College of California, and Naropa, winner of the Ohio Anna Book Award in Poetry and the Alice James New England New York Award. Ali is currently a professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego. Joshua, the floor is yours.
Oh my goodness, Tara, thank you so much. And thank you, Kazim and Derek and Ashley for helping create this space and open it up. And thank you to everyone that's gathered here to spend this time with us. I'm just gonna read a few new poems from my book, Ode, and then I'm gonna read a poem from my son, August, who just arrived a little under 2 weeks ago. This is Barbara's song. Postmodern blackness blacksmith, straight razor reshaping self-esteem. You dream in geometry unreachable by any other means. Speak in entire phrases, abandon standard American etymology, hence you liberate waves from the sea. Cornrows from the cornfield, reclaim fade, so I now hear the word and imagine only abundance. Caesar never meant anything to me, but a cut so close you could see the shimmer of a man's thinking. You are how we first learned to bend language built to unmake us, accept implausible risk. Some much older man, shaver in hand like a baton full of wasp gossip, asking with the grain or against. And the question feels damn near existential, given this is the only place we can live, in such thoughtless proximity to another person's open hands, be held by the face, ask outright to be made glamorous, shaped by your polymathic brilliance, you bi-weekly psychoanalyst, first stop before funeral, before wedding and block party alike, you soothsayer, cooing children to calm as they sit in the chair for the first time, as still a storm as one might reasonably expect, you ethicist, defending hairlines at all costs, your vigilance keeping online and otherwise slander at bay, philosopher king, thesaurus in the drawer, dominoes and scotch and barbasol adorning your countertop, right above the chorus line of clippers swaying to the clamor of checkmates and offhand insults now filling the shop, each moving as if the unfettered locks of some great metal monster, some faraway watcher, and you, guardian of it all, clean as a pope. Ode to the do-rag, which I spell that way, D-U-R-A-G, because that's the way it was spelled on all the clear plastic packets I grew up buying for no more than $2, $2.50 max, unless I was at Duane Reade or some likewise corporatized venue. But who buys the majority of their do-rags at Duane Reade anyway? Who would actually wage war on the do-rag's good name by spelling it D-E-W-R-A-G, as I recently read some sad lost souls do in an article in The Guardian? This isn't botany. This isn't a device one might use to attend to the suburban garden and its unremarkable flora, drying freshly damp wisteria with black silk or the much more common nylon rayon cotton blend. I could see D-O-R-A-G. That works for me. One could argue this version makes more sense even than the spelling I am accustomed to, reflective as it is of nothing other than itself. I have never heard the term do used in a sentence by anyone other than a long-lost colleague at Princeton who once reached wide-eyed for my high-top fade before a swift rebuke, marked by my striking his wrist as if some large though distinctly non-lethal mosquito, surely a top 6 proudest moment of anti-colonial choreography I have dared call mine in this odd improbable life I hold to my chest like a weapon. I know. This wasn't supposed to be about them. You make me inordinately beautiful. Let's talk about that. Or how I'm 12 years old and the cape of a white do-rag billows from beneath my marlin's cap like a sham poltergeist. Flight and failure contained within a single body, worthy core of any early 2000s era New York rapper's coat of arms. I was lying before. Once, while we sat, quiet as mourners on the front porch, my father spat, "That's a nice do you have there," eyeing the soft mess of corkscrew darkness atop his second youngest son's aging face. No sign of the good hair he praised for years to family and co-workers alike. Alas, old friend, you somehow make me even more opaque, make me mystery, criminal, dope boy by the corner of Broadway and 127th, compelling respectable people to reach for smartphones, call for backup, my smooth, adjustable shadow. Like policy or fire, you blacken everything you touch. 2 more poems. This next one, it's called Dad Poem, Ultrasound number 2. It's from my son, August Galileo Bennett. It has a line from Gwendolyn Brooks, and it was inspired by essentially the process of seeing my son come into the world during the COVID-19 pandemic and not being able to attend any of the ultrasounds in person. And seeing him primarily through that screen, I think at first made me feel very alienated, but later it began to feel as maybe there was this other kind of third space we were cultivating together, one that would always be just ours. So this is Dad Poem, Ultrasound number 2, for my boy. Months into the plague now, I am disallowed entry even into the waiting room with mom, escorted outside instead by men armed only with guns and bottles of hand sanitizer, their entire countenance, its own American metaphor. So the first time I see you in full force, I am pacing maniacally up and down the block outside, FaceTiming the radiologist and your mother too, her arm angled like a cellist to help me see. We are dazzled by the sight of each bone in your feet, the pulsing black archipelago of your heart, your fists in front of your face like mine when I was only just born, 10 times as big as you are now. Your great-grandmother calls me Tyson the moment she sees this pose, prefigures a boy built for conflict, her barbarous and metal little man. She leaves the world only months after we learn you are entering into it. In her mind, the year before that. In the dementia's final days, she envisions herself as a girl of 17, running through fields of strawberries, unfettered as a kingfisher. I watch her stance and imagine her laughter echoing back across the ages. You, her youngest descendant born into freedom, our littlest burden lifter, world beater, avant-garde percussionist, swinging darkness into song. And now my last poem before the conversation with Kazim, which I'm super hyped about, is for my father and all the dreams that he passed on to me. This is America Will Be, after Langston Hughes. I am now at the age where my father calls me brother when we say goodbye. Take care of yourself, brother, he whispers a half beat before we hang up the phone, and it's as if some great bridge has unfolded over the air between us. He is 68 years old. He was born in the throat of Jim Crow, Alabama, one of 10 children, their bodies side by side in the kitchen each morning, like a pair of hands exalting. Over breakfast, I ask him to tell me the hardest thing about going to school back then, expecting some history I have already memorized. Boycotts and attack dogs, fire hoses, Bull Connor and his personal tank, candy paint shining white as a slaver's ghost. He says, honestly, probably having to read the Canterbury Tales. He says, eating lunch alone. Now I hear the word America and think first of my father's loneliness. The hands holding the pens that stabbed him as he walked through the hallway, unclenched palms settling onto a wooden desk, taking notes, trying to pretend the shame didn't feel like an inheritance. You say democracy. And I see the men holding documents that sent him off to war a year later, Motown blaring from a country boy's bunker as napalm scarred the sky into jigsaw patterns, his eyes open wide as the blooming blue heart of the light bulb in Crown Heights basement, where he and my mother will dance for the first time, their bodies swaying like rockets in the impossible dark. And yes, I know that this is more than likely not what you mean when you sing liberty, but it is the only kind I know or can readily claim. The times where those hunted by history are underground and somehow daring to love what they cannot hold or fully fathom, when a stranger is not a threat, but the promise of a different ending. I woke up this morning and there were men on television lauding a wall big enough to box out an entire world. Families torn with the stroke of a pen, the right to live, little more than some garment that can be stolen or reduced to cinder at a tyrant's whim. My father knows this, grew up knowing this, witnessed firsthand the firebombs, the Klan, multiple messiahs, love-soaked and shot through, somehow still believes in this grand, blood-stained experiment, still votes, still prays that his children might make a life unlike any he has ever seen. He looks at me like the promise of another cosmos. And I never know what to tell him. All of the books in my head have made me cynical and distant, but there's a choir in him that calls me forward. My disbelief, built as it is from the bricks of his belief, not in any America you might see on network news or hear heralded before the start of a football game, but in the quiet power of Sam Cooke singing that he was born by a river that remains unnamed, that he runs alongside to this day, some vast and future country, some nation within a nation, black as candor, loud as the sound of my father's unfettered laughter over cheese, eggs, and coffee, his eyes shut tight as armories, his fists unclenched as if he were invincible. Thank you.
Be here with you today. I'm with you from San Diego, California, the lands of the Kumeyaay, a nation that spans most of San Diego County and northern parts of northern Mexico in this area. The Kumeyaay people stand in principled opposition to the construction of a border wall across the US-Mexico border, and I stand with them in solidarity. My poem is called The Voice of Sheila Chandra. It's a long poem built of multiple parts, and so I'm going to read 8 small sections from it. Each section is a sonnet. I'll read as many sections as I have time for, and each section is a little sonnet. I'm going to drop some information about Sheila Chandra in the chat. She's a singer who can no longer sing. She suffers from a neurological condition called burning mouth syndrome. There's some links for you there. From the voice of Sheila Chandra. Breaks is constant, was like the river, light on the river, riven that remained a rift, an old rill that sounded. She merged with the vibration of the drum, a hum, a home, womb, and She moaned in the loam, dark earth, come, Sheila, dame, ocean, dome, this poem, roam to tome, tomb, foam, original fountain that fed my mom, Zamzam, when I was born. What represses unhomes in the sound, who has made me. What is made me? Is a voice just muscles and shape and breath to phrase a song, boats assemble at the mouth of the harbor, mouth in, earth, you who wrote an ode to silence, never wrote of what is silenced? I did seek all the resounding caves, let the voice be lit, all the lanterns in the new world. We need the language of stone, from string to string, quiver in the opening, the garden, so beautiful, Lucifer, dark sun of morning, no Eden, but innocence, no expulsion, but after. No more will I listen to other than a single note moaned, not known. I do not hear, think again, what place presents here a body as a battery of one moment to open your mouth, to plug in. I will allow what I invented to find its color, make shape which neither water nor sky do. How do you now, in this contained shape, go through your life, not like a constellation, not guessed at, intuited, or divined, no name. So how do you discern a shape for what is often called God? Sheila Chandra sings without words because a word is a form of rage at death. The implicit formlessness of the body, which translates as the soul, does not cohere. Every feeling of a body as mortal means separately French mot and mort. What do we know and can't tell of the deep black of the world, of death, of the painting on the wall? I, in past days, trusted border zones, relinquished homes, sounds, let the nothing storm in. Was it a sculpture or a recess? Vanta black was made for missiles or planes for defense purposes so dark no eye could see it. Some voices are like that. No one could hear them. It is not good to be lost is more than metaphor for spiritual condition. I sit at the terrace overlooking the green sea. Perhaps it is failure that ought to be sought. The voice that fails falls silent. Sheila's or the bodies, the blue failed me. The sun fails every evening. I, we, you have all failed too. Everyone who strove all these long years for peace failed. In a world governed by storm and noise, why then should a singer not fall silent, though by great suffering her mouth that orchestra hall aflame, the drone, her most minuscule movement still, do the echoes resound? Even now, can I discern them? Anish Kapoor explores this place. Sight disappears. Rich, dark, that opens, he makes shapes of them, invites you to understand or learn where the effort to understand fails. Agnes Martin, her shapes of white, absence, both, what, when the throat fails, sounds out. Does Sheila still listen to music? What does it sound like? Calligraphy is a meeting point between abstract and particular, by certain combinations of visual marks to make symbols. Chandra lost her voice. Around the same time, I found mine. At midnight, we went to swim in the sea so we could be in the dark and not know the bottom, but the moon lit up the surface so silver, so slammed, and then the boy, with the fear of failure, falling, architecture, voice, God, depths, death, he swam. And then I will close with this last sonnet. Who can born then believe, beleaguered, besieged, be seen, leagues from where you started, parted in league with my liege, legions of sound, sounder. Here then be leaved, darkest black and unseen, a voice tracks back. For frown, fawn, fond, founded, fundament firmly this firmament, this fund of sound born where you are. I did not want to be found. How can you say that? How can you now know what foe? No, she sang out, flow, she breathed, be, real, Eve, and lo.
Wow. It was fire. So, okay, the experience, I was wrapped. My attention was caught up.
Thank you. Oh my God, it's like we're in the presence of each other. It's really wonderful. I want to ask you about your book first, because my voice of Sheila Chandra is an ode of fashion, ODE, ode to what's lost, ode to what we don't have anymore, ode to failure.
Yeah.
You have this ode. I mean, what is it to write in the tradition of the ode to some object, or traditionally to some, political hero or emperor? What is available about that tradition to people who are politically and socially marginalized? What is ode, O-W-E-D, to them?
Yeah.
Right? So I'm curious. We're both unicorns. We're in these you're teaching at Dartmouth now.
Yeah.
And you write about the token, and it's one of the threads that runs through this book. So I want to know what it meant for you to tackle this entrenched, very transactional form in the way that you did.
Oh, that's a beautiful question, Kazim. Well, what it meant for me was that I had to return to my sort of first principles, right? Which was that the people I grew up around were beautiful, that they were very, very smart, and that the things that were lovely to us merited celebration and study, right? So for me, the ode, O-W-E-D, is largely about thinking about the poem as a kind of reparative act, right? Of saying these are sites, people, objects that are historically denigrated, objects that, again, I mean, you referenced Dartmouth and the kind of elite academic spaces that we're both in. And there's a way that I was formally trained away from seeing the kind of beauty that had been obvious to me from the time I was very young. And so I think the process of working through my second book of poems was about saying, how do I return actually to that first sight? And how do I sing as beautifully and as loudly as I can these places that made me, right? That made me up. And that deserve to be literature fundamentally. Like, I think that's part of why the cover photo is just me and my dad eating some collard greens. And yeah, right, you know, it's collard greens and cornbread and mashed potatoes. And my mother took the photo, which means she got a check from Penguin, which is great. But it's also really too about saying that space deserves another stage, right? And it's interesting too, because that's related to one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which was about your relationship to history, but also to ethics, right? So looking at your book, it put me in the mind of what does it mean to write about these flesh and blood, complex living human beings while still taking seriously the poet's responsibility to bear witness, right? So even in of course, the title of the collection itself, right? This gesture towards Sheila, but also thinking about Cord Menifee. I mean, the characters in your book are living radical actors. So how did you wrestle with that in the composition of the book itself? And how are you thinking about that as a writer and an educator more broadly, right? How do we ethically write one another?
Yeah, both of the poems, both of the first two poems in the book of the three long poems were poems that interrupted themselves and different things happened to them. So what had happened when I was given permission to write a poem about a national park with a project with Academy of American Poets, yeah. And I was writing about the David Berger Memorial in Cleveland, Ohio. And David Berger was a young athlete who joined the Israeli Olympics team, and he was killed in Munich. And while I was writing this poem, my former yoga student, who was a young Palestinian guy, was trying to train as a sprinter for Rio. This was in the spring of 2016 that I was working on this poem. And Muhammad was the same age as David Berger when David Berger joined the Israeli team. So I think it's just natural that the two came into the purview of the poem. But then what happened while I was working on the poem, the campaign at Yale University to rename the colleges that were named for slave owners was long underway, but no headway was being made. And Cord Menifee is still, he works for Yale still, an African-American dining hall attendant worker, and he smashed the window. There was a question about this window of these laborers walking down the road with cotton. And they look they're very dignified and they look happy and well fed. So there's some question about the ideology behind an image like that. That's the image that's on the front of the book, actually, because he broke it. And what really turned the poem on its ear is that I learned from the conservator at the Yale University Art Museum. I met her randomly at some party once in that ivory castle that we're both involved with, that you meet these types of people. And she said, rather than restore the window, I recreated it in the broken state. That was the moment to me about how do we contend with violent history? What do we do as individuals in this huge political context? David Berger was a law student at Tulane University, young kid. I'm old enough that I think of 27 as a kid.
Same.
Young kid, his whole life in front of him. And there were these forces, political forces, giant forces, bigger than him, and they killed him. So, what are we going to do? There were people watching when George Floyd was being killed, right? Civilians and other police officers who were people of color. So the answers to these questions are not easy. It's not, these are complicated. I think they're complicated questions. So the poem, the nonlinear poem, the structure of it became a way for me to think through, to try to understand what do we do now as individuals.
That's gorgeous.
Okay, the students were organizing, they were out there, they were doing everything they were supposed to do. But you know what it took? it took Corey Menefee getting up on a table with the handle of his broom, breaking that window. And then it was very soon after that that the name of the college was changed. And you know what I mean? So.
Yeah, but I love the way you stage it in the book, right? Because if I'm recalling the line properly, it's really about him going to work every day and gradually growing more and more sort of frustrated with the image, right? It's not sort of spur of the moment. It's something that builds over time. And I think that's such an incredible way to think about framing radical activity.
He thought about it for a long time.
Yeah.
Knew that he knew his job was at stake.
Yes.
It was not just a moment of rage, He just said, I should. There's a quote from him in the book. He said, I should not have to come into work every day and look at that.
Yeah.
It's not.
Right.
He took this action that he knew was not legally right, but it was in his moral code that he had processed. He said, that thing's coming down today. That's what he said. And he said to himself, what he says later that he said to himself. So I want to ask you about this sort of figures that you create. You said you want to honor the objects of the landscape. And so there are three that, there are many, but the three that I thought of were Micah Dudley, LeBron, and Mike Brown.
Wow.
And you also do it in very different. The poem about Micah Dudley is very much in that sort of biblical register, meant to imitate some kind, to me anyways, some kind of hagiography of like creating a scene consciously. The other poems are in different formats. So I just wonder how you two are engaged in the same process that I was in terms of the confronting history. And what does it mean to confront history? What happens next after we confront history?
Right. No, it's a fantastic question. I mean, in the case of the book of Micah, part of what I was really trying to do was think about whether myth gave me another way to think about the way the future might go, right? Instead of sort of a large story to reframe how we think about the past, I was really interested in what if the boy comes back? What if the boy killed at the Brooklyn block party is able to come back? And what if we just sort of close on that note, right? Barely more than just he rose, right? No other clarification. And I think maybe in that, I mean, you're getting me to think now, maybe all the poems are about a certain kind of levitation, right? Because also the idea in Mike Brown as a type of Christ is the idea that there's a kind of cosmological element to it, which is that the people that protest in the wake of Mike Brown's slaying are his resurrection, right? There's a way that the spirit of Mike Brown animates the movement and the people rise up in that way. And then in the poem about LeBron, I mean, in some ways that's about just being 16 years old, riding the bench in high school. But in many other ways, it's about what it meant to be a teenager, seeing another teenager become the center of the sports universe in a time where, YouTube was still pretty new. And we were seeing these clips of this kid from Akron do these miraculous acts, almost every week. And a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is think about everyday, ordinary mysticism and really just say that needs to be at the forefront of our consciousness. I think particularly now in this moment where there's this constant focus on Black death and the denigration of everyday Black sociality. Well, what are the forms that have made that denigration survivable over the course of centuries long struggle, right? It's the turn to myth, to poetry, to song, to gathering and the forms of conviviality that gathering makes possible. So that's what I'm trying to do in the poems, I think. I'm really interested in basketball. I mean, there's also that poem about ankle weights. And it has nothing to do with me being good at basketball, because I'm really not. But all my close friends always were. And it trained my eye as a poet to have my just very tall, fast, beautiful friends be really good at this thing. And for me to just hone my eye at seeing this other form of intelligence they had access to, that was just magic to me. I really had very little other language for it. And I just grew up around a lot of people like that. My sister's here right now. She can just sing. She can wail. My sister's a beautiful singer. I also cannot sing. And so I think being in such close proximity to people that had these other majestic talents, it just brought me back into the writing. One, because it was the thing I was maybe kind of good at, but also because I realized that maybe being one of the many instruments through which the glory of these people was sung, I thought that might be a beautiful way to spend my life. And that actually segues, quite accidentally, I promise, into another question that I had for you.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to know if you could talk about the improvisation of God for a little bit, if that's possible. Because you have this line about maybe God is improvising poetry. Yeah, and I'm like, okay, well, that's just strikingly beautiful, just as a line of poetry. But it also struck me that that's a certain kind of cosmological claim that I think you carry throughout the book, by which I mean, it seems like in the poems, you're saying the future is actually quite open, that we can unhinge meanings in all sorts of ways. Even during the reading, I love that you talked about Vanta Black, the Vanta Black missiles, but actually that darkness actually has all this other semiotic meaning that we can pull out for our own purposes. So can you talk a little bit about the improvisation of God, and also what kind of work sort of spiritual practice is doing for you in this book? Because I think it's maybe similar to what music is doing, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, for me, religious practice has always been rooted in sound, and you know, in every tradition there is, no matter what it is, there is some element of sound, of chanting or singing, that's there, and the singing, the music that happens in the first giant poem in the book is the music of John Coltrane,
Yes.
and Amjad Sabri, who's the Qawwali, Pakistani Qawwali singer, who was also murdered. So there's a lot of people who are killed in that first poem violently, artists or artists who are confronting violence. And I think in Sheila Chandra's voice, the loss of her voice, that is a metaphorical death, of course, for her as well. So I think I was really thinking about how is it that we make sounds, and what's the impact of that sounds in physical space? Because in Vedantic tradition, in Sufi Islam, and in physics,
There's a lot of science in this book.
the
Yeah.
universe is made of sound. That's what we. This is all sound vibrations. So I was really interested in what the idea of musical improvisation has to do with creation, with a capital C. The way you understand it in a Judeo-Christian context, that there's an intelligent God who is created with intent. Yet the beauty of jazz music and the beauty of what Coltrane did, and the music of improvisation, is such a creative force. It's the creative force of chaos, actually. And so I thought, what if it's not an intentional God in the way that we as small humans understand intention, but it is actually what we as small humans understand as improvisation, that God is improvising. Because those quotes from the Quran that I quoted, there's so much in the Quran that is like, you don't know what's going on. But you don't know what's going on. We'll tell you later, but don't act like you know what's going on. And that's so different than the traditional, and that's not like I think this term Judeo-Christian to me is like, it's just not true, because the Jewish theological and spiritual tradition is one of dialogue and argument, not just dialogue. It's like a multiplicity of interpretations across time, right? That's what the Talmud is. You're arguing with people who argue back, but from 300 years ago, and that is truly the not what people think about as orthodox, quote unquote, orthodox or fundamental Islam now. That's a 20th century invention. But real classical Islam is also that, is a dialogue. There's nothing, this concept of originalism of the document, or this is what the Bible says, this is how it's supposed to be. We don't have that, So I think God isn't saying God. I mean, what if God is improvising? I think that's truer to the real spiritual traditions that many of us, including me, are engaged in.
Yeah. I love that. I love that originalism bar thrown in there too. I see how that cuts in a bunch of different directions in our moment. Okay, yeah. I'll let that. Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Yeah.
Because it's hard for me to think, especially in the context of jazz, to think about improvisation without rehearsal. So, like, where do we rehearse for the act of creation, capital C, or for another C word to use, chaos? Like, where and how do we rehearse for that? Because I'm really captivated by that.
As writers, you mean? Or, I mean, musicians practice endlessly in order to then, you can't just get up and riff off of a tune.
Of course, right.
There's hours of work. same thing for dancers. You train every day on the bar doing whatever the exercises are. And I think as writers, we have our version of that, right? Everything I read to you, those Sheila Chandra poems with, the repetitions, it's all composed. There were rough drafts, and then it was shaped and written, and then it was made to be that way, If you asked me to get up in front of an audience and just freestyle poetry, I could try, but I think that's a little bit of a different thing. You bring up some forms. I don't know how much time we have left, but I want to just bring up something for your question for you. You bring up different kinds of knowledge in your book, different ways of knowledge. There is the traditional knowledge that you throw in here, like in ways that someone might be like, so who is the actual audience of this poem? Like when you say about the 99-cent store, for example, that they mock semiotics, So you're bringing in a certain kind of academic knowledge in a critique of the 99-cent store, yet you have this other type of knowledge, for example, this concept of the post-soul apocalypse, or Spade's telepathy, which we all wish that we had, of course.
Come on.
So I'm curious to know about, and then when you say, when you talk about the do-rag, surely a top 6 proudest moment of anti-colonial choreography. I'm pretty sure that's the first time that the phrase anti-colonial choreography was used in a poem about a do-rag. Nice. I couldn't swear to it, but I imagine it was probably the first time. So I want to ask you what it means to you to be mixing these modes, and what are these other types of knowledge that you are, leaning back on?
Yeah, what a generous question. Born of deep study. I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, I mean, so when I was at the Callaloo Creative Writing Conference or workshop rather, in 2013? It was maybe 2013. I took a class with Greg Pardo, and Greg told me to not be afraid to use all my Englishes, is what he said. Because I think I was stuck in this moment. And I came up through Poetry Slam, so I'm a self-taught poet. Spoken word was really my introduction to thinking about the cultivation of poems in any meaningful way. And so I think I was stuck in this place where I thought either this is a spoken word poem or this is an academic paper, basically. Like my first attempts to really get poetry on the page in a rigorous way just weren't great, because they weren't true to the way the language sounded in my head, right? Because the truth of my life was that the first poets I ever saw, were preachers. So these were people often coming out of the King James Bible, right? But they were bringing in contemporary politics. They were bringing in Motown and hip hop and R&B. They were bringing in, Black vernacular from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? They were pulling on a whole tradition. And all of that language was combined in this gorgeous polyglot vernacular, that just had such power to it. And I think I found a new voice in my work when I was able to say, that's my highest aspiration, is what I see sort of not even just the preacher in the pulpit, but my mother in Vacation Bible School, the person on a soapbox on 125th Street in Harlem. When I made that sort of the aim of the language, I thought, all right, well, all these books I'm reading at Princeton have got to go somewhere, right? They got to go in with this other stuff not to enrich it, but just to be in conversation. And when I allowed that collision to really breathe, I think that's what came out. And it all feels, I don't know, they're part and parcel of one another for me. They're really not separate, in part because I think I've always sounded like this. I've always just had this kind of weird voice, in part because part of my punishments growing up, when I would act out, my mom would just make me go read the dictionary in my room, so I think that was part of the Black literary tradition for me, was the kid in his room in South Yonkers trying to make poems out of the air. So I hope it's working. That's what means the most to me.
I mean, you invoke August Wilson, and I think you are very much in his lineage.
Oh my God.
And you were doing him proud.
Kazim, thank you. That means so much. I named my son after, my son after August Wilson. So
he's named after August Wilson.
Yeah. He's named after August Wilson and Black August. So thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for your work and your language. I am shaking and reeling. This was incredible. I'm sorry to have to wrap this up, but thank you again for being here. And we're so grateful to our ASL interpreters, Ashley and Jared, and to Pro Bono ASL for making this evening accessible. And thank you, all of us. Thank you for joining us for Books Noted Live. This is the last one in our series. We're so grateful for your support and for your attention to the poets that we've presented this evening and all of the previous evenings. You can purchase the copies of Kazim and Joshua's books online by clicking the button below, or you can also go to your local bookstore. And recordings for all of our Books Noted live events will be available on our YouTube page and on Poets.org. To check out the rest of our fall/winter events, including a conversation between Claudia Rankin and Terrence Hayes on November 15th, click the button below. And that's that's it. Take good care of yourselves. Take good care of those in your care, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Kazim, it's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Joshua.
We'll talk to you soon.